Thank you very much. I, of course, would like to thank Isabella for the invitation to come over from an island that I live on in Georgia, on the southeast coast of the United States right now. I don't know if you know, you've seen a little bit of her architecture. She's not only a very talented designer, but when the history, or the first volume of neuroscience and its impact on architecture will be published in another 20 or 30 years, that her name will be on, one of the first few pages as a true pioneer.
Okay. You need to hold it.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Her name will be really on the first few pages as one of the pioneers, pioneering architects who brought that architectural perspective into neuroscientific research. I would like to just start by commenting on two terms that architects sometimes use, theory and culture. And if you take the terms back to their original meaning, the Greek theoria, for instance, I like that sort of the notion of contemplation or perception. Because theory, implied there is a little bit of a criticism of theory over the past half century, which has tended to be overly conceptualized at the expense of the perception. And I also like to take the word culture back to its Latin meaning, which is really the cultivation of things that grow. Because, again, that has a little bit of a biological component, which cultural theory, again, has tended to discard in more recent times. And I think culture is probably a good place to begin. We tend to think of culture as something out there, outside of us, that has little effect on us. But at the same time, if we go back through history and look at the great sort of monuments of architecture, one would never say that the Parthenon, for instance, was outside of Greek classical culture. It, in a way, sort of epitomizes what that culture was. And we can follow that down through time, through the Renaissance, where once again, the Renaissance was a movement far more broadly conceived and developed as a movement where culture really extended. Again, you would never look at any Renaissance architectural text and say that it was outside of Renaissance culture. By the time that we get to the 18th century, we still have a fairly strong connection, but it begins to break down. In the around 1750, Greek monuments were discovered. The official sort of proportion and orders of classical times were of the French Academy, Royal Academy of Architecture, were of course based on Renaissance models. And so we begin to have a conflict where really the issue was whether one should accept Greek classicism or whether one should stay with Latin classicism. So we have sort of a little bit of a division between culture and architecture, in the sense that we have a sense there are different sort of approaches that one could take, culturally speaking. If we come to the 19th century, it very quickly becomes a much sort of broader issue, because with, for instance, the Great Exhibition of 1851, we have all of the cultures, or many of the cultures from around the world brought together under one floor plan. And we have a sense where one could look at carpets from Morocco, from Turkey, from China, and from Europe, and begin to understand that there are, although similar artistic values, there's also very sort of this multicultural sort of variations in the way that is interpreted. Now, some years ago I did a lot of work with Gottfried Semper, and a few years ago I went back and reread his work on style. And what struck me at that time was that it was really a work of cultural history, more so than architectural history. It is sort of a taxonomy, as it were. And when you get to his chapter on the dressing, the thesis of Bekleidung, he in particular starts out not with any architectural discussion, but rather with the discussion of the undergarments worn by Ephesian women and how beautiful and formal they were in the way that they shaped the human body, and with the shades of violet, blue, purple, and saffron yellow patterns. So what we have here is really where he's taking what he deems to be high Hellenic culture and then arguing from that architecture had to achieve a similar cultural level because, again, it was part of the same culture, that the Ionic order, for instance, had to have arisen from the same sort of sensibility to form. One can take a later example of the 19th century in the work of Louis Sullivan, who has always been considered a transcendentalist, very much influenced by the school of Emerson and Whitman, and there have been volumes and volumes written on Sullivan, all of which were very good. But what I find interesting about Sullivan is that when you look at his work, you begin to see, for instance, that John Dewey, who was writing and teaching in Chicago at the same time, and who we know from the artifacts of Sullivan's library that he had all of his writings and was reading them. Again, Sullivan lived on the south side of Chicago, which is where the University of Chicago campus is. Of how already at this point Sullivan was being, in a way, sort of attracted to psychology as a way to apply it, as it were, to architecture. And of course, what Dewey's psychology is really underscoring here in 1884, he's drawing upon the new physiological psychology theories coming out of Europe and in particular out of Germany. So already we have this sort of cultural phenomenon of psychology as a new science, and suddenly it makes its way to the south side of Chicago and then into, in a certain sense, into architectural form. We can follow the same sort of connection if we look at the work of Max Weber and the work of the German Workbund. Not only are this a sort of a conflation of thinking between cultural theory and architectural theory, but they knew each other very well. Weber was very impressed and interested in what was taking place architecturally, and similarly all of the architects of the Workbund, at least the leading architects, were reading Weber as well. We can take that all the way down to the mid-1960s when we have the two books by Rossi and Venturi appearing in 1966. Rossi's perspective was essentially European, high European modernism, although he wanted to seek out typologies that were going back to the 18th century as a way to critique the high modernism of his day. Venturi took very much the opposite track. Again, he was well educated and spent a good amount of his time, early youth, in Europe. But at the same time, his argument was basically we want to bring pop culture or low culture into architecture as a way to infuse and to overcome the monotony of high modernism, as it were. Now, one could follow Venturi down through, that sort of conflict between Venturi and Rossi down through postmodern, post-structural theory. But I think it's important to go back and to pick up, cultural theory as it begins to unfold in the 1960s, because this is a very sort of, at least my generation was sort of trained on the anthropological and sociological and psychological theories of this 1960s. But we have this very interesting divide that also appears at this time. Clifford Geertz, who was an anthropologist, believed that culture was something outside of the biological system, that in effect it was the software that was programmed into the biological hardware of the human body. And then you had a series of people that were mostly, in this case, a zoologist, in the case of Desmond Morris, who were quite interested in the fact that we are not really that different from the great apes. That in fact, we are the beast that is molded the social structure, is the beast that in us that is molded the social structure of civilization. So we have a divide which becomes very sharp in the mid-1970s as the sociobiology debate takes place. And here, Edward Wilson, who was a biologist, basically his book Sociobiology, that appeared in 1975, is a harsh critique of the sociology of his day. He argues basically that it is not scientific, it doesn't take into account any sort of scientific thinking or models as they were beginning to develop in the mid-1970s. And as for the idea of Gertz, that culture was something outside of us, he admitted, Wilson admitted that culture does have a certain freedom to move as it will, but it is essentially held on a leash to our genetic structure and makeup. And this forms the basis of the argument as it unfolds over the course of the late 19th century, where culture and genes begin to work itself into coevolutionary theories of human evolution, as it were. So in this case, we have actually two anthropologists, I guess, Boyd and Mischerson were anthropologists, as well as Durham. One of these was a biologist, I'm not sure which. But basically, we have these two disciplines coming together and sort of realizing that you really can't separate biology from genes, that they have to work together. And over the course of the 1980s and 1990s, we have this sort of struggle to see how these two sort of components really work together to change. By the late 1990s, that division, that struggle between genes and culture was really resolved, and I think both in the humanities and the biological sciences, although it's still today, it's still sort of a popular division it's still sort of discussed as if it's still taking place. But we have basically the replacement of individuals. We have a sort of an interdisciplinary construction of a series of models in which, for instance, I've just taken the example of niche construction, which originally was proposed that organisms interact with environments, they change the environments, and those changed environments in turn alter the species within those environments. And then to follow that down into the second paragraph, of course, we are the preeminent species as far as changing our environments. We have constructed houses, cars, farms, nations, and everything else. Therefore, that should have a rather profound effect on how we will evolve, how we will change over time. Now, niche construction, as you see, is over the course of the last 15 years undergone more, in a way, more sophisticated models when you bring in cognition and the development of tools and the like into the equation. But basically, for architecture, it comes down to a very simple principle, and that is just as we, as designers, construct our built environments, so do our built environments really begin to construct who we are and who we will become. So this is what this position, which was really sort of first articulated around the turn of the 21st century, I think is now the statement that Isabella and others are now bringing to fact, that if we design a room for living, for reading, for instance, what would be the, here are just two examples, which is the better room to read, which is the better room to really sort of experience what activity you as designers are sort of bringing into the environment. Also around this time, we have a very, at beginning of, I think, of this century for the most part, we have a very sort of interesting connection between biologists and philosophers, in this case, neuroscientists and philosophers, that we have the beginning of that true sort of interdisciplinary research beginning to take place almost in every field, except I think for architecture. And this is where I think architects have sort of, in a way, have not really sort of understood sort of the profound changes that have taken place within the sciences. I just quoted a couple of philosophers here, Oyama, and this is part of her systems developmental theory, or developmental systems theory, the independence of the organism, or the interdependence of the organism environment, the shift from genes and environment to a multiplicity of entities. Tim Ingold, who's a sociologist, you can see how he's adopted this same sort of language and applied it as a sociological model. And it's interesting with Ingold because he was, again, a sort of a harsh critique of what he felt was the Darwinian sort of biases of neuroscience and terms like neuroaesthetics as they first appeared. And then I just close with Evan Thompson, a philosopher who, again, basically summarizes that the life cycle reconstructs itself from generation to generation by way of myriad independent pathways on multiple levels: genetic, cellular, social, and cultural. Now, this is what I find interesting because we're talking about biological models and suddenly we get the terms social and cultural brought into the equation. And of course, this is I think the approach that we have to take as architects. So how do we apply it to architecture? Well, this is one such model proposed by Thompson and biologist Francisco Varela, where if you're going to look at the human organism, as it were, you really have to look at it on three cycles of operation. And the first being the organismic regulation of the entire body. And effectively, this is the process of homeostasis, the fact that we are organisms within environments, and our bodies, again, have to continually adjust and modify to these particular environments. Secondly, we have the cycles of sensory motor coupling between an organism and an environment. And this is what we've seen with the work of Blanca and Pascalini already today, that we're continually sort of engaged on a sensory motor level with the environment. Space is not a visual phenomenon, it's a tactile phenomenon as well. And then thirdly, we have these cycles of social and cultural interaction. And just translating that into architectural terms, we have human biology and the built environment. Again, those homeostatic adjustments to the environment, the orientation and movements within the environment. Secondly, we have, and I'll clarify this, the aesthetic experience of design. Again, the sensory motor dynamics of how we enact the built environment. And of course, we have the social cultural variation, or area of study as well. Now, and again, these are, it's a very sort of simplistic model, but if we were going to take such an approach to architectural thinking, we have to really start with a set of new criteria, or not new criteria, but criteria that in a way has been ignored, I think, in the theoretical directions of the late 20th century. And first of all, we have to start with the concern of how we experience a built environment rather than with the object that we design and place within the environment. This is obviously, I think, very central to what this type of research should be aiming at. Secondly, I think we have to look at the complexity of perception, not just perception, but of the multisensory experience of design, which has the visual and navigational, the place mapping, proprioceptive and spatial systems, and sensory motor neuroaffective systems, and then of course we have the social and cultural dimensions of design. And thirdly, if you really take that approach, what we're doing is really turning from an overly conceptual approach to architectural design, to one really on the pre-reflective aspects of the architectural experience. Now, this does not deny these other dimensions of architectural thinking, but if we're going to look at the research, it's not really in the conceptual level that we're going to find the answers to how we engage or enact the built environment. It really is going to have to be on the perceptual level. So let me sort of just run through these three divisions in a relatively brief fashion. The first, as far as the biology of the built environment, we've already, in a way, had a lot of research developed over the last few decades of the 20th century and into the present century, a body of research which is generally called evidence-based design. It's most apparent in areas like hospital design, where we've really sort of redesigned the hospital almost in its entirety through research in ways that the patient will heal faster, better, with fewer medications and things like that. That's an obvious direction of the biology of the built environment. I've taken Thomas Albright, who's at the Salk Institute in California, has talked about, now we're reversing the biology. In this case, we're looking at the human eye itself, and Johanni will have something to say about this as well. Which do I press?
Do you want to continue without image for a moment?
Yeah, go ahead.
Otherwise, I can ask you.
It's just restarting itself.
Yes.
Okay.
I could get license because I have the presentation.
Okay. Yeah, let's
So one question, when you said, or maybe we just open up for questions in the meantime, already just for understanding. So when you mentioned the point one on one of the just last slides was the experience of the object rather than the object itself, and that being part of the biology. Is this the link you're doing on this slide right now, or is?
No, on this particular slide, I was talking about the human biology of the built environment. And on one level, we have the homeostasis of how we sort of adjust. We know a certain lighting level, et cetera, temperature that we're comfortable with. An area like evidence-based design attempts to really sort of, very sort of rather simple sort of empirical series of tests demonstrate, what elements within the environment can improve a particular environment, and it's been applied mostly to hospitals, some school design and the like. When I got to the image of Albright, the point I was trying to make is that we can turn that around and look not so much as at the experience in and of itself, but of how the eye functions as a biological component. And in Albright's case, he makes the point that we seem to have certain patterns and certain shapes, and he gives the example of a cable grid in the Gothic cathedral, where we take a certain visual delight in these forms. Well, if this is the case, then it opens up a whole area of research of how and why we take a particular delight in certain forms. An obvious way historically is looking at something like the golden ratio, But in this case, he's really, I think, looking at the fact that over the course of a couple million years, the homogeneous species evolved within the, say, totally within the natural world, and the mechanisms of the eye are more attuned to sort of natural forms with both the complexity of texture, the breakdown of the proportioning of the forms and the like. So that when we look at something like Saint-Chapelle in Paris, we're actually looking at something that's quite familiar from an evolutionary perspective in how the eye kind of functions. You can take that, we can take that, if that's the case, we can look at all of architectural history in this way and say, when we made that passage from a very sort of natural handmade sort of environment to something like the Alhambra, we wanted a certain complexity, a certain compartmentalization of these forms, because again, we take a delight both in sort of the simplicity of the ordering, but at the same time, a sort of a complexity of the tactile surface of the forms in and of themselves. So, again, it's. I think it would be something fairly easy to do research in. You don't need a lot of sophisticated neuroimaging and the like to do some testing in those ways. This is another area of biophilic design which has emerged really since the beginning of this century. And again, it's sort of predicated on the same principle that Albright was talking about, which is the fact that as Homo sapiens, or as the Homo species, which is about 2.3 million years old or so, evolved within the savannas of East Africa. There were certain landscape forms, there were certain patterns, there were certain variables within that environment that we tend to like and replicate within design. More recently, we've sort of moved, I think, beyond the fact that we these sort of tenuous evolutionary connections between our past and the present, to the fact that there's now beginning to develop some research demonstrating that something like forest bathing, which is quite popular in East Asia, which is basically hiking in the woods for about 3 days or so. We've always known that when we do this, we come back very much more relaxed, more cognitively the cognitive acuity is improved, a little bit lower blood pressure, less tension and the like. But now we're beginning to understand that there's certain sort of cellular mechanisms at play here that as he refers to the white, we have a growth of the white blood cells within the human immune system, which maybe can protect us better against things like tumors and whatever. So that biophilia is not just a way of feeling comfortable again within certain aspects of the environment, but really it's a way that becomes very helpful for who we are today. And nowhere is this, I think, more evident in its implications than with urban planning and design. Because I think we really, if we're looking at creating healthy environments, we have to go back and rethink the environments in a very sort of basic way. Over the last quarter century, 30 years or so, China has probably built 20 cities of 5 million people or more. All are predicated on basically Western models, capitalist models of towers and concrete and the like. And as Johan and I were talking about this earlier this morning, there's now a major resistance against this because in a way the Chinese are beginning to realize that this may not be the optimal environments with which to handle this vast migration of rural populations into urban centers. So what would be good models? Well, again, we can go back and look at a lot of studies, and I've just taken 2 examples here. We can go back to a medieval city like Bern and look at the relationship of the greenery to the built areas as one example. And this is the second example from Helsinki, is actually a student proposal that was put together, I'm not sure how long ago, maybe a few years ago, 5 or 10 years ago, where they're looking at the densities of Helsinki and realizing that you could take those same densities and concentrate them in ways that we can add much more greenery into existing sort of urban structures. And of course, the advantage, I mean, the thinking here, and it's very much, I think, recognized across many parts of Europe, is that everyone should be within a 5 to 10 minute walk to an urban park or to a natural area, because this way you can get into nature on a daily basis, in a regular way, and again have that period of relaxation, that release from the urban stress and the like. So I think the implications of something like biophilic design are quite profound when we take it to a level like urban planning, and I think we're going to have to do that very soon. Now, I want to turn to the second part, which is what I call the aesthetic, and again I'll go back to the actual meaning of the word aesthetic, which is really once again perception and sensory feeling. The idea that aesthetics is how you make judgments. Again, it's sort of a Kantian Baumgartner Kantian sort of development of the notion of aesthetics that came out of the mid-18th century. But I would like to keep this notion of aesthetics away from judgments, because I want to put, again, the focus on the individual's experience of the built environment and not upon the built object apart from the human occupant. When I use the term aesthetics, I'd like to see it used not as a quantitative term where this is better than that, but rather as a way to sort of study all aspects of architecture and then inform the architect, as it were. So it does not deny that we always talk about beauty and pleasure with regard to our experiences, but we're really not attempting to measure those. Now, again, you've already seen this image, so I don't really need to comment on it, but again, it sort of underscores, when I look at all of the work that's been done, again, Isabella's work is really at the beginning of it, and again, this is her paper on space relating to this one particular experiment. There have been a couple of other sort of early papers that have explored different areas of architecture, and this one particular study, the actual paper is now heading into publication. And it's a very difficult sort of issue to try to study scientifically, but basically the argument here is that certain environments induce certain sort of mental frame of minds, as it were, and that this is an MRI study, the frame of mind of certain sort of sacred spaces, as it were, bring the rhythms and the activities of the brain in a way that very similar to how one meditates, what happens as one goes into a period of meditation. So, scientifically, it's almost impossible to say that this produces this result, but at the same time, it opens up the question of how do environments really affect us? Is there some way that we can measure these aspects of the environment? And I took one other example from this of the Thorn Crown Chapel, where Eberhard, and this was written about 10 years ago, was wondering why everyone that goes there has almost the identical response. It's a very sort of peaceful, quiet response to this particular chapel, which is on top of a mountaintop in Arkansas. And he hypothesizes that it must be maybe the space above us. This is not fully visible, that when we raise our head, we somehow set off a sort of a body chemistry, as it were, that changes, lifting our eyes up high. He talks about the possible triggering of the hypothalamus, with our sense of alertness, and then he goes back to sort of the biophilic argument that with the surrounding forest, we're in a very sort of pleasing kind of habitat, and so it becomes a very quiet experience because of that. Now, again, I think this is something that can be really sort of tested in many ways, but it hasn't been thus far. But interesting enough, if you look over the last 10 years, we see this kind of this discussion appearing within architectural circles on the idea of atmosphere. Now, atmosphere is, again, not something that we can measure in a way, quantify in a way. However, we do know, I mean, it is in a way sort of preeminently an architectural medium, a creative way for an architect to think of a design of a work not as again, as an object, but rather as an experience, and creatively, how would you sort of modulate that experience to get the effect that you're trying to construct. And of course, as one of those architects has written a book on atmospheres. But again, it's kind of interesting, going back to Blameless work, that this term, which sort of began appearing within artistic circles in the mid-1990s, suddenly comes into architectural circles and becomes a sort of very prominent idea. And again, I'm not, it's an idea that I think can be translated and can be studied with certain approaches. Of course, I think one of the most important discoveries of the last 25 years has been that of mirror mechanisms. Again, going back to the early 1990s in humans, we only were sure that we had similar mechanisms around the turn of this century. But mirror mechanisms are, of course, the process by we look at actions, for instance, two dancers on a stage, and we're actually simulating the motor movements of, at least partially simulating the motor movements of those actions internally. It's called embodied simulation, although we're not actually moving our bodies. And Cabo Moreno, I believe, was at the ATL, right? Switzerland for a while? Originally?
Been there for a while. Originally, she's in UCL.
Yeah, she's in London. But she was one of the first to propose a sensory motor aesthetics for the performing arts. Basically, your argument is that when we go to a stage, we project ourselves into the bodies of those dancers on stage. We're simulating the muscular tensions and relaxations and the movements of the dancers, all as we're simply sitting within our seats. And that we take a delight because in a way we're sort of, because of this projection, we're experiencing ourselves through the agility and athleticism of the dancers on stage. Isabella, of course, made this reference going back to Robert Fischer. These are very old theories, even going back to the 1860s. Friedrich Theodor Fischer was the first to begin to think of our relationship with the world this way. But I like his description with object is at heart physiognomic and emotional. We have that wonderful ability to project and incorporate our physical form into the objective form. Again, this is it has so many implications as far as architecture. When we're in a room, we're sort of projecting ourselves within that space. And again, with parapersonal space and these other elements, consciously we're altering our biological organisms as we engage with these spaces. Another paper which picks up on the same theme from a slightly different perspective was that of David Freeberg and Victoria Galeazzi, and this is, I guess, 7 years old by now, 8 years old. Basically, they point to some early studies of MRI studies of people reading handwriting, for instance, and again, going through that process, when we look at handwriting, we in a way sort of motor simulate our own hand, sort of making those movements within the page. And they come up with these two hypotheses. that, again, a crucial element of the aesthetic response consisting of the activation of embodied mechanisms encompassing the simulation of accidents in motion and corporal sensations. The painting of Lucio Fontana, for instance, did a number of canvases that would paint with a simple color and then take a sharp instrument and slice it down the middle. Their argument is that we basically engage with this because what we're doing is, again, sort of simulating that cut with a cut in our own skin. So it makes us a little uneasy to see this. And they've actually measured this within MRIs where they've taken actual paintings by Fontana and they've placed them alongside computer paintings without the violence of a tear within the canvas. And people have very different reactions to the actual canvases that have been physically cut to those that are sort of simplified through computer simulations. The second aspect of what they propose is that the artist could creative gestures such as the vigorous modeling of clay, paint, fast brushwork, etc., is something that we perceive. So if we look at a Jackson Pollock painting where the paint has been thrown upon the canvas, we sense that sort of violence, as it were, that force of gravity, that force with which the paint itself is, the configurations it takes as it's splashed upon the canvas. They give one architectural example here of a Romanesque, twisted Romanesque column. And of course the argument is that basically when we go into the courtyard of St. John Lateran in Rome, when we see these twisted columns, we in a way sort of simulate in a visceral way the kind of the twisting of our own body, so that we're relating to these forms in the same way that we might relate to a Fontana painting or to a Pollock painting. So again, they've opened the door here to all sorts of possibilities, because it goes back, I mean, we can go back to Rudolf Arnheim, go back to Richard Neutra, we can go back to the early, some of the Bauhaus people, Kandinsky, Moholy-Nagy, when they talked about force and motion, and they did very tactile gymnastic at the beginning of the studios, etc., etc. You see this sort of line of thinking now coming full circle back again to, potentially, to architecture once again. And this is a second experiment that I think has a lot, again, it's the same thing, it has a lot, the implication being that we again relate to the world in a very sort of tactile way and not simply in a visual way. And the four test conditions here was obviously a hand touching a chair, a palm branch touching an arm, a hand touching the arm, and the fourth condition, which was supposed to be the neutral one, was an inanimate object touching an inanimate object. Well, what they discovered was that that fourth condition actually did evoke motor simulation in the same way that the arm was being touched, maybe not as forcefully or so. But their implication, and this is in the final paragraph of this particular paper, is that these same mirror simulation principles seem to apply to any observation of touch, and they give us a raindrop falling on a leaf, etc. Models of embodied simulation posit that the same neural structures involved with our body-related experiences contributed to what we conceptualization of what we observe in the world around us. So, again, this is just a statement within a scientific paper, but think of architecture for the moment. When we can think of it not as a structure or as a series of forms, but rather as materials touching one another. Don't we feel the same sort of connection with these materials and how they are composed? This is a different perspective than what we're typically, I think, taught in school to think about design. But once again, it is a very old sort of idea going all the way back to Schopenhauer that in this particular case, I'm going to shut this door over here. It's really nice. Okay. Schopenhauer, was again arguing that he was trying to put architecture within the list of all the other arts, and he argued that It was really the sort of the lowest art because it had to deal with this conflict of gravity, matter and gravity. Matter wants to fall to the ground in a pile, and the architect, in a very sort of astute way, creates these columns, beams, and arches and whatever to suspend these forces up in the air. At the same time, we continue to read these forces, and this is what gives us a particular delight in architecture. This is actually an interesting sort of architectural thesis that does come into architectural theory with Karl Buttiger's ideas of Semper's. If you read De Still closely, he makes all sorts of allusions to this same sort of dynamic, in particular with his discussion of rustication. But what all of this really brings us back to is a very old sort of architectural concept, which is somehow, I think, gotten under-stressed in recent years, which is the idea of detailing, or the idea of craftsmanship, how we put something together, how do these materials touch one another, how do we express those connections. I can only speak for the schools in which I've taught, but it has always astounded me that almost no detailing ever appears in the final jury reviews. Students inevitably tend to want to take two-thirds of the semester conceptualizing what they want to do as a design, but very, very little time in terms of developing that concept, as it were, into a detailed and sort of articulate solution to the problem. I am also convinced that really craftsmanship is not something that we just sort of, in a way, discuss afterwards. I think it's something that we really sort of intuitively see the moment that we see it and understand it for what it is. As, again, as sort of as Ruskin would say, some kind of human labor put into form, which animates the form. So that this, I think, is another area. And if we're going to be able to begin to look at architecture in aesthetic terms, can we really study materials, gravity, the forms, light, textures, colors, spatial forces, etc., etc. All of these areas are really open to research, and very little research has been done on any of these areas in recent times. So there's so much, I think, out there that can be developed, and we're just really at the very beginning of this kind of this new age, as it were. And I'll just stress again the point of such research is not to prescribe sort of solutions to the architect, but rather to simply inform the architect, to put the emphasis again back on the built experience of the design rather than on the conceptualization of what is there. Now, turning to this third area of the social cultural nature of the built environment, we have actually, again, learned an enormous amount about ourselves over the last 15, 20 years. And there's been a true sort of biological revolution, I mean, going back even to the sequencing of the human genome and things like that. We're now understanding ourselves. I mean, when I was schooled in the 1960s, I was taught that, you know, social intersubjective relationships were in a way sort of cultural values. It's something that you learn as a child, and you sort of grow up within a set of these particular values. We now know that a fetus, if we have twin fetuses in a womb, by the 14th week of gestation, they are reaching out to each other and becoming involved with each other. So in a way, human interaction is not something culturally formed. It's something very much a part of who we are. I just looked at, put in this 1983 study by Metzloff, where a child, an infant 43 minutes old, can begin to imitate the movements of the tongue or the mouth. And again, there were all sorts of explanations of how could this happen. There had to be some sort of biological basis for this. This is a more recent paper. In fact, I think it just appeared a year or two ago, where he now brings in the idea of neuromechanisms, of how these sort of early interactions take place. Of course, an infant has no sense of the self, it has no sense of its body. It's really simply responding on a motor level, at least the first few weeks after birth, until the eyes begin to form. The other area that we've learned a lot about ourselves is, again, through human evolution, and this is Lucy, who goes back more than 3 million years ago, one of the first upright primates. We have always thought, if you look at archaeology or paleoanthropology of the last years of the 20th century, there was always sort of this issue, well, why did the brain really start growing the way that it grew? Lucy's brain was about that of a present-day chimpanzee, and she was sort of the first one of the early generations of primates to come down from the trees, as it were, and walk upright. There were various arguments put forth. Well, it must be the upright carriage, it must be this, it must be that, better nutrition, etc., etc. But I think what we're sort of discovering with more recent proposals, hypotheses like that of Robin Dunbar, is that what demanded that brain, which consumes 20% of the body's metabolic input, developed, it was a very costly development in an evolutionary sense to take that much energy away from the human body and put it into the organism of the brain itself. His argument is that basically we developed these large brains simply because of our social relations got more complex. So that if once we advance beyond the nuclear family, as it were, to the clan, to the tribe, to the community, to the affiliations and surrounding communities of friends and enemies and the like, we needed a way to in a way, sort of understand other people better in order to enhance sort of our own survival skills. If you look at how this sort of plays out over the last 2 million years as the Homo species comes into existence, Homo erectus is sort of a generic term. There are basically, some people break them down into 2 or 3 other subspecies. But already 2 million years ago, we have that large brain increase. We have joint intentionality hunting, greater range of hunting, and we have the gesturing. We probably had a proto-language, even though the mechanisms of the larynx and the like had yet to develop to the sophistication to support language itself. We no doubt had laughter. I mean, we know that early use of fire goes back at least 2 million years ago, 2.5 million years ago. When food was brought back from the hunt, there had to be some sort of a human exchange, as it were, of happiness with the meal. Homo heidelbergensis, about 700,000 years ago, begins to appear. Another 50% brain increase, and we have a number of other things beginning to unfold. The communal hearth, the ability of mentalizing, which is really started to read the expressions of, and by the way, I didn't mention this earlier, but mirror mechanisms. I mean, there's been a lot of studies now that it also exists, obviously on a emotional level. That if we see a sad movie, our eyes will well with tears. Well, this is because we're in effect projecting ourselves and simulating what the actor is portraying, say, within a film. But we also know that there was likely music. At least 400,000 or 500,000 years ago, there was dancing, there was probably some form of ornamentation, and there was at least some form of architecture going back at least 400,000 years ago, which is twice the antiquity of Homo sapiens, which appears 200,000 years ago. So, given this fact, I think we really are going to have to turn to some of these other fields, like ethology, like anthropology, which is now sort of integrated a lot of these sort of biological premises into their own sort of models and thinkings of who we are. And I just put 5, Ellen Disianiaki in her book Art and Intimacy, that appears around the year 2000, looking at, it's interesting because she's always been a harsh critique of neuroaesthetics on the grounds that it excludes the human emotional component to response to each other in the world in which we live. And this is something that I didn't stress earlier in the talk, but basically when we go to that pre-reflective level, we're really going to the emotional level. And interesting enough, emotion is something that almost never appears in architectural theory, as it were, between probably the entire second half of the 20th century. Now, how did something as important to our basic emotional response? Emotion is simply defined as the response of an organism to a stimulus. Here we have an organism within the environment, and yet the word emotion never appears within recent architectural literature. Why have we sort of avoided what is so obvious, which is, again, finding meaning, hands-on competence, sort of built-in elaboration. All these things are really sort of built into our human structure, as it were, the human organism. And it's really, we have to begin to really, in a serious way, bring this notion of socialization and culture into architectural design. Again, just like emotion, we have not said anything about culture, I think, over the last quarter century or so, and really much more as far as a serious discussion of the idea of culture. So, again, this is not something that we can look at directly from the point of view of, say, neuroscience, but we can look at it sort of indirectly. And I just cited a little bit of a paper from Jake Panksepp, who is an effective neuroscientist, and Colin Trevarthen, who's a very renowned psychologist studying infant development. And again, that their argument is that basically we have these sympathetic resonances and intersubjective contagions which we pass on with one another as we speak and talk and understand one another, and that these are really sort of tied to these underlying sort of emotional systems which in humans go back, really, I mean, in an evolutionary sense, goes back well to the very beginning of mammals as far as evolutionary development goes. That we're only now beginning to understand that we do communicate at these levels. And these are very important levels to communicate because, again, we can look at someone and know right away often their intentions, and we're always trying to evaluate whether those intentions are honorable or dishonorable or not. So in any case, this is something that we're sort of biologically equipped to go at from the very beginning. So, and I put this in because this is another area which again is that emotional response that I was referring to. We now sort of identified these pleasure circuits in last one. And we know exactly what takes place, where and when and why with this reward and emotional system. And then finally, I just want to conclude with this one image. Because I think what it underscores, and this is, I think the importance for architects is that we're not going to ever find solutions in the sciences as far as, but what we can find is information and directions, but it's really up to us as designers to sort of carry this information and put it into realization. I've put in this little citation from Semper, the dressing and the mask as old as human civilization, and it's really sort of the essence of art. And then the idea that play is older than culture. I think play is a term that really has to be put back into architectural discourse. An architect is really, in a way, sort of a scriptwriter, a designer of atmospheres, as it were. But it doesn't work if the people for whom the architects design do not understand or respond in the way the architect thinks they will respond. But also, I mean, design is in itself a play, a form of play, and I think this is really what the essence of what when we think of architecture, at least at the beginning of our education, it is a form of play. It's something that makes us very happy to do. And I think, of course, we have to keep that notion, that playful notion through as we develop all this knowledge. So that's all I have. Thank you.